All right, I'm going to get started. Folks, welcome to week 2 of early U.S. history. Today we're going to be talking about colonial America. Okay, we're shifting from pre-colonial America to the age of colonial America, about the years 1607 to 1754. Specifically, what I'm going to be talking about today pertains to what you all probably recognize as the 13 British colonies. I have a couple different objectives that I want you to be able to understand by the end of large group today. By the end of large group, I hope that you understand the differences between the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies. These regions, although they are all British colonies, they have very distinct characteristics. I also want you to identify the groups of people who challenged established colonial authority in society. Not everyone, as we move throughout time in this era, is thrilled with the way that Britain is governing the American colonies. Give you just a few more seconds to write these down, and then we got to move on. Okay. We're going to start in the northeast, the New England colonies. We're going to start with Plymouth and the Pilgrims. So, who are the Pilgrims? Well, if you did that Saints and Strangers assignment in small group, maybe some of you did it, some of you didn't, that's okay. Pilgrims, they're radical, religious, separatists, and dissenters. They are not fans of the Church of England, okay? The Church of England, there's no separation between church and state in England at this time. So the government has state-sponsored religion. It's called the Church of England. These pilgrims are not happy with that. They think that that is not correct, not the right way to go about things. And so they are breaking away from the Church of England. They think that it's still too Catholic. Initially, they leave to go to Holland, but they don't stay very long. There's a little over 100 what we'd call pilgrims that leave Holland to sail for the Americas. Their purpose in coming over is to practice their religion freely, right? They're coming to America to practice their religion freely. However, they're very hesitant to accept others into their society in the colonies who practice other religions. So they don't necessarily like being persecuted over in England, but then they are not very open and accepting of other religions in this area of the colonies. Many of the pilgrims die due to pretty harsh conditions on the trip across the Atlantic. And they are going to need assistance from the native peoples who are living in the Americas where they land. Early on, these pilgrims have a hard time growing in numbers. Okay? They rely on more people to come over from England to the Americas rather than by natural reproduction. Okay? So they have a hard time growing in numbers unless more and more people survive the trip over to the Americas. Later on, this group will kind of morph from what we'd call pilgrims into what we would call Puritans. So just so you know, this is just a map. This is where these pilgrims first land. They call their colony New Plymouth, or it's known today as Plymouth, off the coast of Massachusetts. Well, moving forward in time, the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay Colony. So these Puritans are going to settle in an area that becomes known as Massachusetts Bay, about the place that we know of modern day, the state of Massachusetts. And they're led by a governor named John Winthrop. That's a picture of John Winthrop up there on the screen. And John Winthrop has a mission to make Massachusetts Bay Colony what he'd call a city on a hill. You're going to want to write that down, a city on a hill. These Puritans are not necessarily the type of, they're not separatists exactly like the Pilgrims were that came, a decade and change before them. But what they want to do is, in the Americas, establish a colony that showcases how to celebrate your religion, practice your religion in a true, pure, and holy Christian way. Okay, Winthrop is trying to create a true, pure, and holy Christian colony for others in England who might be unhappy with the church. And so he says, hey, come over to our colony. We're a city on a hill. We're practicing religion the correct way over here. So initially, you have about 1,000 Puritans settle in Massachusetts Bay Colony within the first about 6 years, 1630 to 1636. By 1636, you have about 16,000 Puritans moving to Massachusetts Bay Colony. So initially in 1630, about 1,000 Puritans settle. Then you have about 16,000 more move to Massachusetts Bay Colony by 1636. About 16,000 by 1636. Well, what is life in New England like in the colonial era? Most people who are coming from England to this region of the American colonies are coming with families. Okay, they're coming with families. Some do come with servants or enslaved peoples, but just know the majority of them are coming as a family unit. Father, mother, and children. Men are going to be the ones that are responsible for running the colony. Their government is going to be heavily influenced by their religious beliefs, okay? Something that we would maybe call a theocracy today. Right? They want to create this city on a hill, therefore their government is going to be heavily influenced by their religious beliefs. Massachusetts Bay Colony becomes highly successful down the line as the years go by in the 1600s. So they're highly successful. They have a rather high life expectancy for this era in history, and many individuals end up owning their own land. Early on, primarily, the New England colony's economy is going to be based on farming. Okay, that's why you got the picture of the farm scene up there. However, there are some, because Massachusetts is located close to the Atlantic Ocean, there are going to be some that start to engage in fishing and kind of make their living that way as well. Well, I just told you that Massachusetts Bay Colony is governed by men who are part of the Puritan Church, right? What we would call, more than likely today, a theocracy. There are some individuals that move to Massachusetts Bay Colony, though, that don't necessarily fit into the very strict Puritan way of living their lives, okay? Specifically in the town of Salem, those who didn't adhere to the Puritan lifestyle, religion, were likely to be accused of being witches. Usually, those who are accused of being witches in a place like Salem in the 1600s, late 1600s, were women. However, other factors also contributed to the accusations that get thrown around of somebody being a witch, including class, age, and race. So I'm not going to go into all the details, but here in this highly religious, superstitious area of the American of the colonies, people like women, okay, of lower class standing, older people, minorities are going to start to be accused of being witches or practicing witchcraft. At the peak of the trials, about 200 individuals were accused of witchcraft. 20 eventually were executed after being found guilty. By the fall of 1692, many people began to question the trials, whether this was the right thing to be doing, all that kind of stuff. And so eventually the court that was trying these people being accused of witches was disbanded. And by May of 1693, the remaining that were accused but hadn't yet been convicted and executed were released from prison, and the trials were effectively over. Okay, this was a part of their history that the Puritans kind of wanted to just forget about. Okay, you know those 20 people that we executed for being witches? Just forget about that. Let's all just kind of move on. Okay? Sure. Sorry, say that again. 1693. Okay, we're going to switch gears. We're going to talk about the southern colonies here. Jamestown, Virginia, established in 1607, becomes your first permanent British colonial settlement in the Americas, North America specifically. This is different than people settling in New England, okay? Adventurous young men are primarily coming to settle at Jamestown. This is not people coming with families. This is adventurous young men coming to the southern colonies. Sometimes they're called the Chesapeake colonies as well. These young men are followers of the Church of England. Okay, the official term for the Church of England is Anglicanism. These young men are not interested in farming and hard labor. In fact, the furthest thing from it. They're hoping to gain wealth very quickly by finding gold and strike it rich, and then go back to England to hopefully move up in social class there. But they do not find gold. Okay, the get-rich-quick schemes do not work in the southern colonies. The Church of England, Anglicanism is the term for that. Initially, these settlers have a really, really bad experience. Okay, they don't want to work hard. They don't find their gold, and so things are not necessarily looking super bright for these young men settling at Jamestown. Disease spreads rapidly. It's pretty hot, humid there. The citizens of Jamestown do not work well together either. Okay, so lots of things not going well for those who first settle at Jamestown, Virginia. There's just a depiction of where Jamestown is at, okay, right along the James River. They named it for their king, the King of England, James I. Well, you've got like a historic site that's still there, but the town, the building, the little fort, I don't think is there anymore. Okay, let's talk a little bit about economy and labor in the southern colonies, okay? Probably 9 to 10 years into first establishing Jamestown in 1607, so around 1616, these young men are saved, okay? And I'll tell you what saves them. Tobacco, okay? The climate and the soil of the southern colonies, specifically in this case Virginia, allowed for the cultivation of tobacco, which becomes the major staple of the Southern colonial economy. Tobacco wouldn't grow super well over in England, okay? It's not the right climate. They don't have the right soil over there. And so tobacco becomes, like I said, becomes known as a cash crop, and demand for tobacco exports from the southern colonies to England really helped to save these early settlers in the colonies from economic ruin. In the Carolinas, rice and indigo also became major cash crops, okay? Indigo would be something that you'd harvest, and it's used to dye textiles. And so those became major cash crops in the late 1600s to mid 1700s. Initially, the majority of labor for tobacco cultivation in the southern colonies was performed by indentured servants. These are lower class white individuals from England who sign a labor contract, basically saying, hey, I will sign away 4, 5, 6, 7 years of my hard work and labor if you, this wealthy guy over in the colonies, pays for me to come over and I will work for you. Okay? So initially, these indentured servants are the ones who are performing the hard labor to cultivate tobacco in the southern colonies. If these people survive their indenture, their labor contract, they would be given freedom. However, because disease was so prevalent over in these colonies, a lot of these indentured servants never saw the day where their indenture ended and they gained their freedom. Towards the end of the 1600s, the number of lower class white indentured servants coming to the Americas significantly decreased, which paved the way for what we know as the enslavement of Africans, okay, replacing indentured servitude as the primary forced labor source in the southern colonies. So you can see there, right, enslaved Africans in Virginia, specifically in the 17th century, 1600s, doesn't really start to tick up until mid-century, okay? And even then, between 1650 and 1675, it doesn't go up a whole heck of a lot, but after 1675, that's when indentured servitude kind of goes by the wayside in the Americas, and the enslavement of Africans picks up. Obviously, enslaved peoples from Africa not super thrilled with being enslaved, forced to work for no wages, mistreated. And so there are times where some of these enslaved Africans get together and they rebel. It's what we call violent resistance. Okay? The Stono Rebellion is one of your first violent resistance attempts by enslaved people. This took place in South Carolina, started in South Carolina. Rumors began to circulate amongst the enslaved population of South Carolina that escapees from bondage had successfully made it southward to Spanish-controlled Florida, okay, where they obtained land and freedom. An enslaved man that we only know today as Jemmy, this guy's name was Jemmy, he is going to be the leader of what ends up becoming called and referred to as the Stono Rebellion. And so initially, Jemmy and about 25 other enslaved individuals escaped from their plantations. They armed themselves and they started to march south towards Florida. Ultimately, about 50 enslaved peoples participated in total in the Stono Rebellion. And along the way, as they're making their way southward, they kill 25 white South Carolinians. Now, they don't get super far. They never reach Spanish Florida. Most of them are recaptured by October of 1739, just about a month and change after the rebellion really gets underway. One of the big consequences of this violent resistance attempt, this rebellion, is that many of the southern colonies passed really, really harsh laws, okay, that limited when enslaved peoples could assemble, whether they could earn any money at all, and it also restricted their ability to learn to read and educate themselves. Moving on to our last British colonial region, the Middle Colonies. All right, so we've got three regions: the New England colonies, the Southern or Chesapeake colonies, and the Middle Colonies. Well, the founder of the Middle Colonies, specifically Pennsylvania, is a gentleman that we know as William Penn. Okay, maybe some of you, how many people have ever eaten Quaker oatmeal before? Does this guy look familiar? He's like the guy on the Quaker oatmeal box, yeah? No, maybe kids don't eat Quaker oatmeal anymore, I don't know. So, William Penn, he's the founder and leader of Pennsylvania. One of the key traits of the Middle Colonies, and there are two, there's two big things that you'll want to know about the Middle Colonies. One of the key traits, specifically in Pennsylvania, which William Penn founds, is that these were areas, these were colonies committed to ensuring religious freedom for all. Okay, the Middle Colonies, they are colonies that are dedicated to ensuring religious freedom for all, right? Very, very different than the New England colonies, where Puritanism is the religion. Anyone else is kind of an outcast that doesn't adhere to strict Puritan lifestyles. Quakerism. So the Quakers become the dominant religious tradition in the Middle Colonies. Okay, again, they have their own tenets and beliefs that they follow. However, they are also accepting of different beliefs. Because of this religious tolerance, the Middle Colonies attracted a very diverse group of people from various backgrounds and ethnicities. Okay, so the Middle Colonies is a very diverse place, both when we're talking about religions and when we're talking about the people that are living in these Middle Colonies. Here's the second thing that you need to know about these Middle Colonies. Sometimes we referred to them as the breadbasket of the colonies because farming is the main occupation of the people who are settling in this region. They are going to be able to grow crops very, very well in this region of the country, and so they are going to be referred to as the breadbasket of the colonies because farming is just such a major occupation there. Okay, so just to give you a snapshot of what we would come to know as the 13 colonies and then eventually states, which colonies go with which regions. So your New England colonies, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Your Middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware. Now I throw Delaware in the Middle colonies. Some historians might dispute that, but that's where I'm gonna throw Delaware. The southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Okay? So there are your individual colonies that make up these colonial regions. All right. Hopefully that gave you a good snapshot of these three regions, and again, kind of got to our first objective of identifying differences between these three regions. Okay, they all have very unique characteristics, and we'll dive more into that in small group this week, I'm sure. Now, there are some in the Americas, in these British colonies, who are not necessarily super happy with the way that the crown over in England is governing the colonies, with the way that the governors who are sent over by the British monarchy are governing the individual colonies. And so there are going to be a few different groups of people that start to challenge colonial authority in this era. One of the first movements that becomes a major challenge to British colonial rule and authority is a religious movement and revival, something that we call the First Great Awakening. Okay? Just like I said, the First Great Awakening, it's a widespread religious revival across the colonies, both New England, Middle, and Southern, that emphasized emotional and personal religious experience. Okay, so religion for these folks involved in the First Great Awakening, it's a very personal relationship. So this breaks away from established and traditional church practices that existed back in England. Okay? The relationship between man and deity, in this case God, right, is not supposed to be a necessarily personal experience being converted to religion. Again, like I was saying, there's no separation between church and state over in England. So personal relationship with a deity isn't really a thing in the established Church of England in this era. Two of the more famous preachers that come out of this First Great Awakening, a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Edwards and another gentleman by the name of George Whitefield. So they're two of the more notable preachers of this movement. They're both extremely charismatic and passionate when they deliver their sermons, okay? I mean, they're up in your face, they're ranting and raving. Up here, I've got a picture of Jonathan Edwards' arguably most famous sermon that he preached, and the title of the sermon, this will make you feel really good when you walk in to church. Sinners in the hands of an angry God, right? Yeah, and sometimes these messages last 1 hour, 2 hours, and you're being yelled at a lot, okay? So like I said, they're extremely charismatic, very passionate when they deliver their sermons. Before the First Great Awakening really takes off, religious authority, like I said, is centralized in established churches. So here's the big takeaway. How does the First Great Awakening challenge colonial authority? Well, the Awakening's emphasis on spiritual equality before God, right? Anybody can convert to Christianity in the eyes of someone like Jonathan Edwards or George Whitefield. So the emphasis on spiritual equality before God planted the seeds for political equality in the Americas, right? In questioning authority. If people could challenge the authority of the ministers back in England, state-sponsored Church of England ministers, maybe, and just maybe, they could also question the monarchy as well. Okay? The second movement that really challenges colonial authority in this era is the Enlightenment. Now, some of you are probably familiar with the Enlightenment. We talked about it in world history last year. Just a basic definition. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement with roots in Europe and the Americas that emphasized reason, science, and human progress over tradition and unquestioned religious and political authority. I'll say that one more time. The Enlightenment was an intellectual movement with roots in Europe and the Americas that emphasized reason, science, and human progress over tradition and unquestioned religious and political authority. And so probably in the Americas, for sure, your most famous adherent exemplar of Enlightenment principles is this guy up here, Benjamin Franklin. Okay, hopefully everyone in here has heard of that name before. Benjamin Franklin, without a doubt, serves as the embodiment of Enlightenment ideals as a political thinker, a writer, a scientist in the Americas during the first half of the 1700s. Now, Enlightenment political philosophy taught people who adhered to these principles that governments exist to protect the natural rights of all citizens. We'll talk a little bit more about natural rights next week. Okay? But basically, the Enlightenment also they get people starting to question the authority of the crown. They're talking about things like promoting constitutional limits on power, inspiring colonists to question royal authority and control over the colonies. The Enlightenment and these principles about natural rights really lays the intellectual groundwork for the build-up to the American Revolution, which we'll talk about more next week. Finally, I hope I've given you a good snapshot of the differences between these colonies, these colonial regions, and then also giving you a couple different groups to think about when thinking about challenges to colonial authority and rule. Well, what's the future of North America look like? Well, kind of depends on the colonial region you're talking about when you're talking about the British colonies, but I want you to notice that map up there. Britain, England, is not the only European empire with land claims, colonies in North America. Okay? You see those British 13 colonies that we just kind of talked about over there on the right side of the map. Well, France has laid claim and owns all of the area that's shaded in blue there. And y'all see how that British region on the Atlantic coastline and the French region butt up against each other, right? Well, both of these empires, these European empires, believe that some of that land is theirs and not the other European empires. So there's going to be problems coming down the pike in colonial America, okay? And so Britain and France are eventually going to go to war with each other over some of these disputed, contested land claims. And I want you to make sure you understand this and write this down. Native Americans, right? We learned about early Native American societies. They're still there. They're still living. Some have been pushed off their ancestral homelands. These Native Americans are going to have a tough decision to make. Am I going to ally, is our tribe going to ally with the British in this war, or are we going to ally with the French? And that becomes the crux of the issue when we talk about the French and Indian War, which we'll talk about in small group. That's all I got for you all today. Make sure that you take a picture, both front and back, of your large group notes, or however your small group teacher wants you to turn in your large group notes.